You know, there are moments in life when everything changes in an instant. 1 second, the world is exactly as you knew it. And the next, everything is different. This is a story about one of those moments. A story that will remind you that sometimes the greatest miracles don't come from money or power. They come from a heart that refuses to look away. So please stay with me, because what I'm about to share with you, it's going to move you in ways you might not expect. Picture this. A boy lies on cold marble floors. His eyes are closed, his body is trembling with shock, and kneeling beside him is a young woman, her hands shaking, holding something small, something dark, something that's still moving. Grace, what did you do? The butler's voice cuts through the air like a knife. He's frozen, terrified. He doesn't understand what he's seeing. Then footsteps. Heavy, urgent footsteps thundering through the hallways of this enormous mansion. Mr. Marcus Bennett bursts into the room. This is a man whose wealth could buy cities, a man who's used to control. But right now, his face is pale with horror. "What happened to my son?" he shouts, rushing forward, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. Grace looks up at him, tears streaming down her face, her lips trembling. "I didn't hurt him, sir," she whispers. "I swear, I was only trying to help." "Help?" Marcus barks. His voice is thunder. "You touched my son? You went near him without my permission?" Slowly, so slowly, Grace opens her palm, and inside, there's something no one expected to see. Something strange, dark, wet, glistening under the chandelier light. Everyone in that room takes a step back. You can feel the fear, the confusion. The silence is so thick you could cut it with a knife. Until... Dad? One word, soft, fragile but real. It came from the boy, the same boy who was born unable to hear, the same boy who had never spoken a single word in his entire life. For a moment, nobody moves, not even Marcus. His eyes go wide. His breath catches in his throat. And that's when he realizes this maid, this young woman he barely knew existed, had just done the impossible. My friends, what I'm about to tell you is a story about love, about faith, about the kind of miracle that all the money in the world could never buy. Stay with me until the very end, because what happens next, it's going to touch your heart and remind you that sometimes the most powerful healing comes from the people we least expect. Let me take you back to where it all began. The Bennett Mansion wasn't just a house. It was a statement, a monument to success. Every corner gleamed. Every chandelier sparkled like diamonds under the sun. The floors were so polished you could see your reflection in them. But you know what? Something was missing. The house was huge. Enormous, actually. But it carried an emptiness that no amount of decoration could hide. It was like a beautiful shell with nothing alive inside. Servants moved quietly from room to room, their footsteps barely making a sound. They said Mr. Marcus Bennett liked it that way. Quiet, controlled, perfect. Marcus was a man who lived for perfection. His world was made of schedules, meetings, contracts worth millions of dollars. He wore expensive suits. He drove luxury cars. He attended galas where people whispered his name with respect and maybe just a little bit of fear. But behind that calm, controlled face lived a father who couldn't sleep at night. Because his only son, Liam, had been born deaf. No medicine, no doctor, no expensive treatment from any corner of the world had changed that. And believe me, Marcus had tried everything. He had spent years flying across continents, paying specialists who promised hope, who showed him charts and studies and breakthrough treatments. But every single time, he came home with the same thing. Empty silence. Liam was 10 years old now. 10 years of never hearing rain tap against windows. 10 years of never hearing his father's voice say, "I love you." 10 years of living in a world where sound was just a concept. Something other people experienced, but he never could. Sometimes Liam would sit by the window in his room and press his small ear against the glass, watching the trees outside move in the wind. They looked like they were whispering secrets. Secrets he could never, ever hear. The mansion staff had learned to communicate with him using simple signs. Though, honestly, most of them barely tried. Some pitied him. Others, they almost seemed afraid of him, as if his silence carried some kind of bad luck that might spread. But there was one person who looked at him differently. Her name was Grace. Grace was new to the mansion, a young woman in her mid-20s. She wore the same plain uniform every day, washing it carefully by hand each night and tying her dark hair neatly in a bun. She had come looking for work after her mother fell ill, leaving Grace with hospital bills she couldn't even begin to pay. She needed this job desperately. Grace worked quietly, never complained, never gossiped with the other staff. She kept her head down and did her work with a kind of quiet dignity. But beneath that calm face, there lived a heart full of memories she could never forget. You see, Grace once had a little brother. His name was Samuel. When they were children, Samuel lost his hearing after a terrible infection. Grace still remembered the day it happened, how the doctors turned them away because her family couldn't afford the treatment, how her mother cried silently in the waiting room, how Samuel died just a few years later. In silence, never hearing Grace's voice tell him she loved him one last time. Since that day, Grace carried a promise inside her heart. A silent, sacred promise. If she ever met another child like Samuel, she would never, ever look away. The first time Grace saw Liam, he was sitting on the grand marble staircase, arranging toy cars in a perfectly straight line. He didn't look up when she passed by with her cleaning supplies, but she noticed something about him right away. He didn't move like most children. He was too careful, too still, too alone. His eyes held something she recognized immediately. Loneliness. From that day forward, Grace started leaving little things for him. A folded paper bird on the steps, a small chocolate wrapped in gold foil, a note with a simple drawing of a smiley face. At first, Liam didn't react. The gifts would sit there untouched for hours, but one morning, Grace came to clean and found the chocolate gone. And the paper birds? They were sitting right beside his toy cars, arranged in their own little line. Slowly, so slowly, something began to change. When Grace cleaned the windows near his playroom, Liam would come close, watching her reflection in the glass. She would turn and smile, wave at him, and he started waving back. One day, Grace accidentally dropped a cup. It shattered on the floor. And Liam, he laughed. Silently, yes, but he laughed holding his stomach with both hands, his whole face lighting up. It was the first time anyone in that mansion had seen him smile like that. Day by day, Grace became the only person Liam truly trusted. She taught him small hand signs, making them into games, and he taught her how to see joy in the smallest things, a sunbeam on the floor, a butterfly outside the window, the way water rippled in the fountain. Grace didn't treat him like a patient. She didn't treat him like someone broken. She treated him like a boy who deserved to be heard in his own way. But not everyone was happy about their growing friendship. One evening, while Grace was wiping down the long dining table, the head butler approached her. His voice was sharp, cold. "You should stay away from the boy," he said quietly. "Mr. Bennett doesn't like the staff getting too close." Grace looked up startled. "But he seems happier," she said softly. The butler's eyes narrowed. "That's not your concern. You're here to clean, not to bond." Grace said nothing, but inside her heart disagreed. She knew what loneliness looked like. She had seen it destroy her brother. And she saw it every single time she looked into Liam's eyes. That night, after all the other staff had gone to their quarters, Grace sat by the small kitchen window. The old clock on the wall ticked slowly, steadily. She thought about Samuel, about how no one had cared enough to notice his pain, how he had slipped away while the world looked the other way. She wouldn't let that happen again. The next morning changed everything. Grace found Liam sitting in the garden, scratching at his ear. His face was twisted in discomfort. She could see he was in pain. She knelt beside him and gently signed, "Are you okay?" He shook his head. "No." Grace leaned closer, tilting his small head slightly toward the sunlight. She wanted to see what was bothering him. And then she saw it. Deep inside his ear, something was glistening. Something dark, something that looked wrong. Grace blinked, her heart suddenly racing. It looked like a small shadow, and it seemed to be moving? She thought maybe she was mistaken. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. But Liam winced again, touching his ear with frustration. Grace spoke softly. "Let's tell your father, okay? He can get you help." But Liam's response shocked her. He shook his head violently, then signed quickly, frantically, "No doctors." His hands were trembling. He signed again. "They hurt me." Grace froze. Pain flashed in his eyes. Real, deep, traumatic pain. And in that moment, she understood everything. Liam wasn't just afraid of hospitals. He was terrified. Years of treatments, tests, examinations. They had traumatized this little boy. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She lay in her small room behind the laundry area, staring at the ceiling. The image of that dark thing inside Liam's ear haunted her. What if it was something serious? What if it was the reason he couldn't hear? She thought about calling someone, but then she remembered how this household worked. Without Mr. Bennett's approval, no one listened. And Mr. Bennett, he barely even knew her name. The next day, things got worse. Liam kept touching his ear, wincing, his small face scrunched up in pain. Grace followed him into his playroom, her heart pounding with worry. She didn't know what to do, but she couldn't just stand there and watch him suffer. She whispered to herself, "Lord, please guide me." When Liam winced again, tears filling his eyes, Grace made a choice that would change absolutely everything. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver pin, the kind she used to fix her uniform when a button came loose. She knelt beside Liam and said quietly, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." Her hand moved closer to his ear, and at that exact moment, the door behind her creaked open. Someone was watching. The sound of that creaking door made Grace's blood run cold. She turned slowly, and there he was, Mr. Marcus Bennett, standing in the doorway, his expensive suit perfect as always, his face calm but sharp, like a man used to being obeyed without question. "What are you doing?" His voice was low, but it carried weight, authority. Grace quickly stood up, hiding the small pin behind her back. "Sir, I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was in pain. I was just trying to help." Marcus's eyes moved from her to his son. Liam sat on the floor, still holding his ear, blinking back tears. "You're not a doctor," Marcus said firmly. "If something is wrong with my son, you call me. You don't touch him." Grace lowered her head. "Yes, sir, I understand." Marcus sighed deeply, running his hand across his face. You could see the exhaustion, the years of disappointment weighing on him. I've had too many people promise to help him, he said quietly. All of them failed. I can't take chances anymore. His voice cracked slightly on those last words, but he quickly straightened up, putting his armor back on. You can go now, he added coldly. Grace nodded, fighting back the tears rising in her eyes. She wanted to speak, to tell him what she saw, but his tone told her not to. She turned and walked away, her footsteps slow and heavy. When she reached the hallway, she leaned against the wall and whispered, He doesn't know how much that boy is suffering. Hours passed. The mansion returned to its quiet rhythm. Maids polished furniture. The cook prepared dinner. Guards stood outside like statues. But inside Grace's heart, the silence was deafening. She couldn't stop thinking about Liam, the way he had touched his ear, the dark thing she had seen inside, the fear in his eyes when he signed no doctors. That night she went to her small room and sat on the edge of her thin bed. Her old Bible lay open beside her. She wasn't reading it. She just stared at the pages. Lord, she whispered into the darkness. What do I do? The clock ticked slowly. Each second felt like an hour. She thought of Samuel again. His last day came rushing back. The way he had looked at her, trying to say something he couldn't. The helplessness she had felt. She had promised herself she would never stand by and watch another child suffer. Never. Grace stood up suddenly. She couldn't sleep. Couldn't rest. She walked back through the empty hallways, her bare feet silent against the cold marble. The lights were dim. The house asleep. Only the faint hum of air conditioning filled the air. She stopped outside Liam's room. The door was slightly open. Inside, a small night lamp glowed softly. Liam was awake, sitting on his bed, his hands pressed to his ear again. Grace slowly pushed the door open and stepped inside. It hurts again? She signed gently. He nodded, his eyes wet with tears. He was trying not to cry. Grace's heart broke. She knelt beside the bed. Let me see, she whispered, even though he couldn't hear her words. He hesitated, then leaned forward. The lamp's light touched his small ear. And again, she saw it. Something deep inside. Glistening, moving slightly. This time she was absolutely sure. Something was in there that didn't belong. Her breath caught in her throat. It's okay, she whispered, trying to keep her voice calm. I'll be very gentle. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver pin. Her hand trembled so badly she could barely hold it steady. Just hold still, sweetheart. Liam looked scared, but he nodded. Grace took a slow, deep breath. Please, Lord, she whispered. Guide my hand. She moved the pin closer. Carefully. So carefully. The small dark shape seemed to move deeper, like it was trying to hide. Then she felt it. The tip of the pin touched something soft. Sticky. Carefully, so carefully, she hooked it and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then something slid out. Small. Wet. Falling into her palm. It was black. Round. And it was moving. Grace froze. Her entire body went rigid. Her heart nearly stopped. She didn't know what this thing was, but she knew it shouldn't have been inside a child's ear. Liam's eyes went wide. He touched his ear, blinking fast, confused. Then he gasped. Grace leaned forward, terrified. Liam, are you okay? His hands went to his throat. Then his mouth opened, and a sound came out. Rough. Broken, but real. Grace's whole body froze, her lips parted, her eyes filled with tears. You spoke, she whispered. The sound came again. Softer. Clearer. Grace. Her heart stopped. He had just said her name. She dropped the pin. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. "Oh my God," she whispered. You can hear me?" Liam suddenly covered his ears, flinching at the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. His eyes filled with fear, but also wonder. Grace moved closer, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's okay," she said, her voice trembling. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're hearing for the first time." Liam looked around the room, his face full of confusion and shock. He pointed to the window where the wind rustled the curtains. "Sound?" he asked, his voice shaky. Grace nodded, smiling through her tears. "Yes, that's sound." She didn't notice the door opening again. The butler stood there, eyes wide, frozen in shock. "What on earth?" Grace turned around, startled. "Please don't shout," she whispered quickly. "He can hear now. I don't know how, but he can hear." But the butler didn't believe her. He stepped back and shouted, "Mr. Bennett, come quickly." Liam jumped at the loud voice, covering his ears, whimpering in pain. Grace hugged him gently. It's okay. Don't be scared." Heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. Getting closer. Faster. Marcus appeared at the doorway. His face was pale, his voice like thunder. "What is going on here?" The butler pointed at Grace with a shaking hand. "Sir, she was touching him again. And look at the boy." Marcus's eyes moved from the butler to his son. Liam was shaking, clinging to Grace. His lips were moving, trying to form words. Then, out of nowhere, a single word came out. "Dad." The entire room went completely still. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. His body froze as if time itself had stopped. For 10 years. 10 long, painful years. He had dreamed of hearing that one word. Grace looked at him, tears running down her face. "He can hear, sir," she whispered. "He really can." Marcus couldn't move. The butler stood speechless. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. Then Liam spoke again, his voice weak, but so real. "Dad, don't be mad." Marcus's legs nearly gave way. His eyes glistened with tears he hadn't cried in years. He whispered to himself, That's my boy's voice." But shock quickly turned to fear, then to anger. His voice rose. "What did you do to him? What did you put in his ear?" Grace shook her head, terrified. "I didn't hurt him, sir. I only pulled out something that was already inside." "Something?" Marcus shouted. "You could have killed him." Before Grace could answer, the sound of running feet filled the hall. Security guards rushed in, surrounding her. "Sir, please," Grace cried. "Listen to me. He can hear now." But Marcus's voice was ice cold. "Take her away!" As the guards grabbed her arms, Liam screamed. "No!" It was the loudest word he had ever said, and the last thing Grace heard as she was dragged away was the boy crying her name. Grace sat in the cold security room, her hands cuffed together, tears drying on her cheeks. The guard stood near the door, silent, waiting for orders. From somewhere in the mansion, she could still hear Liam's faint crying. Every time he shouted her name, her heart broke a little more. She whispered to herself, "God, please let them see I didn't hurt him." Upstairs, chaos had erupted. Marcus was pacing back and forth in the living room, his mind spinning out of control. His son had spoken. He had heard his voice. It was impossible. For 10 years, every single doctor had said it would never happen. Yet a maid he barely knew, had done it in minutes. The butler tried to speak softly. "Sir, maybe we should call the hospital. The boy might be in danger." Marcus nodded quickly. "Yes, call them now. Tell them to send an ambulance. I want every specialist ready." Within minutes, flashing lights filled the long driveway. Paramedics entered the mansion and carried Liam gently on a stretcher. The boy kept trying to speak, his small voice trembling. "Dad! Grace helped!" But Marcus couldn't even look at Grace. His mind was too clouded with fear and confusion. He followed the stretcher outside, his heart torn between hope and terror. He didn't know if what happened was a miracle or a catastrophic mistake. At the hospital, the air smelled of disinfectant and worry. Machines beeped softly. Doctors in white coats rushed around, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Marcus stood behind a glass wall, watching as they examined his son. His hands trembled. Something he hadn't felt in years. He had faced business rivals, politicians, world leaders. But now, standing here watching his own son, he felt completely helpless. One of the doctors came out. He spoke carefully, choosing his words. "Mr. Bennett, we ran preliminary tests. His hearing seems to be restored, at least temporarily." Marcus blinked. Temporarily? What does that mean? The doctor adjusted his glasses nervously. "We don't know yet. We found signs of irritation in his ear canal and some kind of foreign substance. We'll need to run deeper tests." "Foreign substance?" Marcus repeated, his chest tightening. "What kind of substance?" The doctor hesitated. "Something biological. We've never seen anything quite like it. It could have been there for years." Marcus turned pale. "Years? You're telling me that all these specialists who treated him, they never noticed?" The doctor avoided his eyes. "Sometimes these things are complicated." "Complicated?" Marcus's voice rose, though he tried to keep it low enough not to scare Liam. "I paid you people millions. Every year I flew him across the world. You scanned every part of him, and you missed something sitting right inside his ear?" The doctor swallowed hard. "Mr. Bennett, maybe you should sit down. There's something else." He opened a folder and slid it across the table. Marcus frowned and looked down. Inside were medical reports, signed and stamped. He started reading. His eyes moved faster with every line. Then he stopped. At the bottom of one report were words that made his stomach twist. "Maintain diagnosis for continued funding approval. Bennett account remains active." Marcus's mouth went dry. He read it again, just to be sure he wasn't seeing things. It said exactly what he feared. They had been lying. His son was never properly treated. They had kept him deaf to keep the money coming. He slammed the folder shut, his whole body shaking with rage. You monsters," he whispered. "You sold my son's pain for profit." The doctor looked down, ashamed. "Sir, I had no knowledge of that side of things. The board handles those accounts." But Marcus didn't even hear him anymore. He turned and walked straight out of that office, his head spinning. Each step felt heavy, like guilt pressing down on his shoulders. He had trusted them, believed every promise, because it was easier than facing the truth. At the end of the hallway, he saw Liam sitting up on the hospital bed. The boy was smiling weakly, a small bandage near his ear. He looked so small, so fragile, but alive. Marcus's chest tightened. For the first time, his son could look at him and hear him breathe. "Dad," Liam said quietly, his voice shaky but real. Marcus froze. He couldn't even answer. Tears filled his eyes before he could stop them. He walked closer and sat beside the bed. His hands trembled as he touched Liam's face. "You can really hear me?" he whispered. Liam nodded and smiled. Then he asked the question that hit harder than anything else. "Where's Grace?" Marcus looked away. "She's not here." "Bring her," Liam said softly. "She helped me. She's not bad." Marcus's throat tightened. For a long moment he couldn't speak. Then he stood up and turned to the nurse at the door. "Tell the guards to release the maid. Bring her here." Minutes later, the door opened again. Grace walked in, her uniform wrinkled, her face pale but calm. She looked like someone who had cried too long but had no tears left. Liam's face lit up when he saw her. "Grace," he said, his voice weak but joyful. Grace covered her mouth, gasping. "You can still speak," she whispered in wonder. He nodded, laughing softly. "You helped me." Marcus stood silently in the corner, watching them. Something inside him cracked open. All the pride, the anger, the disbelief, it began to fade. What replaced it was guilt. Deep, painful guilt. He looked at Grace and spoke quietly. "How did you know? How did you even think to look inside his ear?" Grace hesitated. Her voice was low, humble. "I noticed him touching it every day, sir. He was in pain. I thought maybe there was something small stuck. I didn't want to hurt him, but I couldn't just watch." Marcus's eyes softened. "And you pulled that thing out?" She nodded. "I don't know what it was. It moved. Yeah, it looked like it had been there a very long time." Marcus turned toward the doctor again, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "All these years, and not one of you checked properly, not once." The doctor looked defeated. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett. This shouldn't have happened." Marcus exhaled deeply, his eyes wet. He looked back at Grace, standing there so quietly, so humbly. "You saw what none of them did," he said softly, "because you actually looked." Grace didn't answer. She just lowered her head. "I didn't do it for thanks, sir. I did it because I couldn't let him suffer." Marcus swallowed hard. His voice cracked. "I thought money could fix everything. I was wrong." The room went silent. All that could be heard was the faint hum of machines beside Liam's bed. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his tone calmer, softer. "Grace, I owe you an apology. I should have listened. I was blinded by fear." Grace shook her head gently. "You're a father. You were scared to lose him. I understand." Marcus's eyes glistened again. He nodded slowly, looking at her with something new in his expression. Respect. As the night grew quiet, Marcus sat beside his son, holding his small hand. Liam leaned against him, sleepy but smiling. Grace stood near the door, watching them. For the first time, there was peace in that room. Not the cold, empty silence the mansion once had, but the warm kind, the kind that comes after tears, after healing. Yet deep inside, Marcus knew this wasn't the end. If the hospital had lied, others had too. He was about to uncover something much bigger than he'd ever imagined. And this time, he wouldn't be silent. Morning came slowly, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over what the night had revealed. The hospital corridors were quiet. Marcus hadn't slept. He sat in the waiting area, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. His mind replayed every mistake, every blind trust, every check he'd signed without asking questions. He had let them turn his son into a business. When Grace walked up to him that morning, he didn't notice her at first. She stood quietly, holding a paper cup of coffee. "You should drink this," she said softly. "You've been awake all night." Marcus looked up. His eyes were red, his face exhausted. "You didn't have to bring me that," he said. Grace sat down beside him. "You didn't have to believe in me either," she replied gently. For a moment, they sat in silence. But it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. It was peaceful, almost healing. Then Marcos spoke. "The doctors admitted it," he said quietly. "They knew what was happening. They kept it hidden because it brought them money." Grace closed her eyes briefly. "That's cruel," she whispered. Marcus nodded slowly. I've spent years building things. Companies, systems, hospitals, programs. I thought I was helping people, but now I see the world I helped create only listens when money speaks. Grace looked at him. Then change it, she said simply. You have the power to. He turned his head toward her, his eyes filled with something new. Purpose. You're right, he said. I will. A few hours later, Marcus called a press conference right there in the hospital's conference room. Reporters filled the space, cameras flashing, microphones ready. No one knew why the famous businessman had suddenly called the media. Marcus stepped up to the podium, his face calm but firm. Grace stood in the back corner, watching quietly. He began to speak. Slowly, each word steady and heavy with meaning. For 10 years, I was told that my son would never hear. I paid for the best doctors, the best technology, the best promises money could buy. And I believed them. He paused. But last night, a maid in my home did something no expert could. She gave my son back his hearing. The crowd murmured. Cameras clicked faster. He continued, his voice growing stronger. What we discovered later is worse than I ever imagined. My son's condition wasn't fate. It was profit. He was kept sick so people could keep getting paid. The room went completely silent. The weight of his words hit everyone at once. Marcus lifted a folder filled with medical papers. These are the documents that prove it, signed by people who swore an oath to heal, but chose greed instead. This is what happens when compassion is replaced by money. He paused, looking down for a moment, then raised his head again. I was part of that world. I ignored what truly mattered. But from today, that changes. His voice softened but carried power. I am launching a new foundation. Free medical care for every child with hearing problems, no matter where they come from, no matter what they can pay. Reporters began clapping softly. Some wiped their eyes. Marcus smiled gently. And the first person I'm hiring to lead that mission is Grace. All heads turned toward her. She froze in surprise, her hand covering her mouth. She taught me what it means to listen, Marcus said. Not with money, but with the heart. After the conference and when everyone had left, Marcus found Grace outside the hospital entrance. The air was cool, the sun bright but gentle. Grace still looked shocked. Sir, you don't need to give me anything, she said quietly. I was only doing what was right. Marcus shook his head. You didn't just help my son. You opened my eyes. You reminded me that people matter more than power. She smiled faintly. I'm glad Liam is okay. That's all I ever wanted. Marcus's expression softened. He keeps asking for you, Won't stop saying your name. Her smile deepened, tears welling in her eyes. He's a brave boy. When they returned to the room, Liam was sitting up in bed, playing with a small toy car. He looked up as they entered and grinned. Grace, he called out. Grace's heart melted. She ran to him and hugged him gently. I missed you, she whispered. Liam laughed softly. You sound happy, he said. Grace smiled through her tears. That's because I am. Marcus watched them quietly. For the first time in his life, he saw what love looked like when it was pure, simple, real. It wasn't the kind that needed big gestures or fancy words. It was the kind that simply stayed. Days later, the mansion felt different. The air that once felt heavy now carried laughter. Liam ran through the hallways, his little feet tapping against the marble floors. He still spoke slowly, carefully, but every word was a treasure. Grace returned to work, but not as a maid anymore. Marcus made her part of his household. Someone trusted, someone family. Every evening they all sat together in the garden. Marcus reading reports for the foundation, Grace teaching Liam new words, and Liam laughing at the sounds he once could never hear. Sometimes Marcus would just sit and watch them, the two people who had changed his life. In those moments, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. One evening, as the sunset and the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Liam looked up from his drawing. "Dad, can I say something?" Marcus smiled. "Of course, son." Liam pointed to Grace and said slowly, clearly, "She's my hero." Grace covered her face, trying not to cry. Marcus looked at her with a proud smile. "She's mine too," he said softly. Later that night, when everyone was asleep, Marcus stood by the window of his study looking out at the quiet garden. The fountain outside glistened under the moonlight, the same one that used to remind him of silence. But tonight it sounded different. He could hear the water, steady, alive, and it reminded him that silence was no longer his world. Grace passed by the doorway quietly, carrying a folded blanket. "You're still awake?" she asked gently. Marcus nodded, not turning from the window. "Just thinking." "About what?" He smiled gently, finally looking at her. "About how sometimes the smallest voice can change everything." Grace smiled too. She stepped into the room and stood beside him, looking out at the same view. "That's true," she said softly. They stood there in silence for a while. The good kind of silence. The kind that needed no words. The kind that felt full instead of empty. When Marcus finally turned to her, his eyes were soft. Vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "Thank you, Grace. You didn't just give my son his hearing back, you gave me mine." She lowered her eyes humbly. "Sometimes we all just need someone to listen." Marcus nodded slowly. "And this time, I will." Outside, the fountain kept flowing, the sound gentle and full of life. Inside, laughter echoed faintly from Liam's room. A sound that would never, ever again be taken for granted. For the first time in 10 long years, the Bennett mansion was not a house of silence. It was a home filled with the sound of love. But you know what? The story doesn't end there, because the ripples of what happened that night, they spread far beyond those mansion walls. Within weeks, news of Marcus's press conference had gone viral. People around the world saw the footage. They heard his confession. They learned about Grace. Letters started pouring in, thousands of them, from parents with children who couldn't hear, from families who'd been turned away from hospitals because they couldn't pay, from people who had lost hope. And Marcus read every single one. He sat in his study late into the nights, reading story after story, his heart breaking and healing at the same time. There was a letter from a mother in a small village. Her daughter was 7 years old and had never heard a bird sing. The local clinic had no equipment, no specialists, no hope to offer. There was one from a father who worked 3 jobs but still couldn't afford the surgery his son needed. Another from a grandmother who was raising her grandson alone after his parents died, watching him grow up in silence because she couldn't afford to help him. Each letter was a reminder of what he'd almost missed, what he'd almost lost because he'd been too busy, too proud, too wrapped up in his own world to see. Grace would often find him in that study, surrounded by letters, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "You can't save everyone," she said gently one night. Marcus looked up at her. "Maybe not, but I can try." And he did. The foundation launched 3 months later. It wasn't just a building with his name on it, it was a network. Clinics in rural areas, mobile units that traveled to villages, partnerships with doctors who believed in healing, not profit. Grace became the heart of it all. She trained staff. She visited families. She held the hands of frightened children and told them in her gentle voice, "It's going to be okay, I promise." And people believed her, because she had lived it. She had lost someone she loved to silence, and she had helped bring someone back from it. Liam often went with them on visits. This brave little boy who was still learning about sound, still discovering new words, would sit with other children and show them it was possible. He would sign and speak at the same time, bridging two worlds. And when the other children heard their first sound, when they spoke their first word, Liam would clap his hands and laugh with pure joy. Because he remembered. He remembered what that moment felt like. One afternoon, about 6 months after that fateful night, Marcus, Grace, and Liam visited a small clinic in a rural area about 3 hours from the city. They were there to meet a little girl named Hope. The irony of her name wasn't lost on anyone. Hope was 6 years old, born deaf. Her mother worked as a seamstress, sewing clothes by hand to make ends meet. Her father had left when he found out about Hope's condition. When they arrived, Hope was sitting outside the clinic, drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick. She looked up when their car pulled up. Her eyes were curious but guarded. Grace knelt down beside her. She signed, "Hello. My name is Grace." Hope's mother gasped. "You know sign language?" Grace smiled. "I do, and so does my friend here." She gestured to Liam. Liam came over and sat down next to Hope. He signed, "I used to be like you. I couldn't hear anything." Hope's eyes widened. She signed back, "Really?" "Really," Liam said out loud, still signing. "But then Grace helped me, and now I can hear everything." Hope looked confused. She touched her ear and then pointed to his. "Yes," Grace said gently. "And we're going to help you too, if your mother says it's okay." Hope's mother had tears streaming down her face. "Please," she whispered, "please help my baby." The procedure was simple, much simpler than anyone expected. The doctors examined Hope carefully, and there it was, the same thing that had been in Liam's ear. A parasitic organism that had been living there, blocking the ear canal, preventing sound from reaching her inner ear. No one knew how common it was because no one had been looking for it. But now they were. When Hope opened her eyes after the procedure, the first sound she heard was her mother's voice saying, "I love you, baby." And Hope, the little girl who had lived in silence her entire life, whispered back, "Mama?" Her mother collapsed, sobbing. Grace stood in the corner, tears streaming down her face. Marcus put his hand on her shoulder. "You did this," he said quietly. "All of this started because you refused to look away." Grace shook her head. "No, this started because a little boy needed help, and God put me in the right place at the right time." Marcus smiled. "Maybe. But you still had to choose to act." The months turned into years. The foundation grew. Thousands of children received treatment. Families were reunited with sounds they thought they'd never hear. But more than that, something else changed. The medical community was forced to look at itself. Investigations were launched. Corrupt doctors lost their licenses. Hospitals revised their practices. Marcus used his influence and his fortune not to build monuments to himself, but to tear down the systems that had failed his son. And slowly, painfully, things began to change. Grace continued her work, never seeking recognition, never asking for praise. She just showed up every day for every child who needed her. And Liam? Liam grew. He thrived. By the time he was 12, he was fluent in both sign language and spoken English. He became a bridge between two communities, advocating for deaf children, helping them find their voices in whatever way felt right to them. He never forgot what silence felt like, and he never took sound for granted. One evening on the anniversary of the night everything changed, the three of them sat together in the mansion garden. The fountain flowed, birds sang, wind rustled through the trees. Liam, now almost as tall as Grace, looked at her thoughtfully. "Grace, can I ask you something?" Of course, she said. That night, when you decided to help me, weren't you scared? Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. Terrified, she admitted. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know if I would hurt you. I just knew I couldn't stand by and do nothing. But why? Liam asked. I was just some kid in a mansion. You barely knew me. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but they were gentle tears, healing tears. Because you reminded me of someone I lost, she said softly. My little brother. And I made a promise to him, even though he couldn't hear it. I promised that if I ever met another child suffering like he did, I would never, ever look away. Liam was quiet. Then he reached over and hugged her. I'm glad you kept your promise, he whispered. Marcus watched them, his throat tight with emotion. So am I, he said quietly. So am I. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Marcus realized something profound. For years he had measured his life in achievements, in deals closed, in money made, in power accumulated. But none of that mattered, not really. What mattered was sitting right here, in this garden, with these two people who had taught him what it meant to truly live. A maid with nothing but a compassionate heart, and a son who had found his voice. He thought about all the children they'd helped, all the families they'd brought together, all the lives changed because one person chose to care, and he smiled, because he finally understood. True wealth wasn't in a bank account. True power wasn't in a boardroom. True success wasn't measured in profit margins. It was measured in moments like this, in the sound of laughter, in the gift of hearing, in the choice to love. My dear friends, this is where our story ends, but really it's just the beginning, because somewhere out there right now, there's another child who needs help, another person who's suffering in silence, another family desperately searching for hope. And the question is, will someone notice? Will someone care? Will someone refuse to look away? Mr. Marcus had all the money in the world, yet it took a young woman with nothing but kindness in her heart to open his eyes and his soul. Grace didn't heal Liam with science or magic. She did it with love, with attention, with a heart that refused to ignore pain. She didn't just make a boy hear. She taught a father how to listen. And that is the greatest miracle of all. You know, sometimes in life, silence doesn't come from our ears. It comes from our hearts. We get so busy chasing success, chasing comfort, chasing the next big thing that we stop hearing the people who truly need us. We walk past suffering because acknowledging it might require us to act. We ignore pain because getting involved is inconvenient. We choose blindness because seeing means we have to care. But Grace showed us something different. She showed us that sometimes all it takes is one person who decides to look, to really see, to step forward when everyone else steps back. You don't need money to change a life. You don't need power to make a difference. You just need a heart willing to feel someone else's pain as if it were your own. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or forgotten, remember this story, because somewhere, someone like Grace still exists. Someone who listens when the world stays silent. Someone who sees when everyone else looks away. Someone who cares when caring seems foolish. And maybe, just maybe, you could be that person for someone else. Because that's all it takes to bring back hope, to bring back life, to remind us what it truly means to love. If this story touched your heart, I want to ask you to do something for me. Hit that like button, not just for the algorithm, but as a reminder to yourself that compassion matters. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story that reminds you why humanity is worth believing in. And turn on those notifications, because there are more stories like this, stories that will make you feel, stories that will make you think, Stories that will change the way you see the world. But most importantly, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what lesson did Grace's story teach you today? Your comment might be exactly what someone else needs to read. It might inspire them to listen with their heart, to notice the suffering around them, to be the grace in someone else's story. Because at the end of the day, we're all connected. We all have the power to heal. We all have the ability to love. We just have to choose it. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Thank you for listening. And remember, the world needs more people like Grace. People who refuse to look away. People who choose love over convenience. People who listen not just with their ears, but with their hearts. Be that person. Be that person. Until next time, keep listening, keep caring, keep loving, and never, ever underestimate the power of one compassionate heart to change everything.